Well, hey, everybody. For my interviews, I spoke with Hunter Holbrook of Journey Christian Church, which is my church, and Darren Fred, who works with a church called Commonplace. Hunter Holbrook is one of the newer hires at our church, but he's actually been preaching and things at church for around 15 years. He's around my age and was just hired as the discipleship pastor, but is preaching regularly at our church. He's coming from my own church background, and so it's the Independent Christian Church, which I would describe as a evangelical, conservative, non-denominational church, very sermon-centered, with often with like altar calls or a sort of response time afterwards, contemporary music, things like that. And Darren Fred is probably approaching retirement age. I don't know his exact age, but he's been doing this for a long time. From what I know of his story, he was actually, as a young man, was a plumber. It was a charismatic Christian and a plumber, and often people would just pour out their hearts with him again and again and again. And eventually, a church hired him and started this church at a coffee shop downtown in Fort Collins called Everyday Joe's, and it functioned as both a coffee shop with a Sunday morning service in downtown Fort Collins for a long time, and really left a footprint on the community there. And Darren was a big part of that. And so in recent years, that has shifted. It's was sort of sponsored by one of the larger Assembly of God churches in town, and recently has stepped out on its own. And so now it's called Commonplace, and it's one of the open and affirming churches in Fort Collins. We know Darren. We have a long history with Darren. He's actually the one who performed our wedding. His personality, he's a pretty quirky dude and can really go off on tangents and stories. And so people love him and connect to his kind of uniqueness and his storytelling capabilities. And so anyway, I thought that they would both provide some really interesting contrasts, even though they both have existed within the non-denominational world. And so when it came to a summary of the gospel, Hunter gave what I would describe as kind of the more Bible college-like layout, or more standard discussion of how you would hear it. He talked about John 3:16. He talked about God's love, Jesus' sacrifice, finding new life in Christ and the hope we have in Christ. But then also, in I think a very positive way, brought in the sort of bigger picture of our being invited into that mission. And so the gospel, the good news, is that we have that relationship and now get to be a part of that ministry of reconciliation in the world. I really like that he brought that into it. He didn't talk a whole lot, or I don't think he actually ever brought up the resurrection or new creation, which is something that kind of stuck out to me. Darren was much more choppy, and as I know Darren, he just sort of mentioned some themes, and I also know that this was in part because he was trying to speak it in a sort of personal and authentic way, and trying to avoid some of the like catchphrases that are often used. And since I just threw it at him, there wasn't a lot of context in the conversation, but he brought up just words like, it was like love, God, hope, Christ. But he eventually got into the idea of the good news being Jesus. And so it was interesting because when I asked about the gospel, again, Hunter, I hadn't even thought about this until talking about this contrast, but Hunter focused more on the message of what is salvation and how we're saved, or how we saved through Christ. And for Darren, it was much more of who is Jesus and what did he do and say, and what does it have to do with us, which was interesting. Again, it was a little bit less about salvation or the specifics, the mechanisms, and more of how, to quote him, he actually said how Jesus invites us into a truer self and a truer story. And so this idea of authenticity was really big for Darren. For preaching the gospel at a wedding, Hunter talked about the foundation of marriage as a covenant portrayal and how things flow naturally out of that in the message. He also brought up how the story, there's a way that this covenant is the foundation of where we all come from, and the ways that when a wedding has communion as a part of the service, it sort of brings up this very natural opportunity to explain more or share more explicitly the gospel through that. For Darren, he brought up the way that the settings actually shape a lot of how the gospel comes out, and so depending on who the audience is or even who the couple is and their own faith background or, not having a faith background, but that generally he approaches weddings as a celebration of love and marriage more generally as a vehicle of the gospel, that we are invited back into our origins in Eden. He actually said specifically back into our origins of being naked and unashamed before God, which was interesting. And so he saw weddings as this invitation to be reunited with God. At the funerals, I thought this was interesting. Hunter right away said he thinks it's a lot easier to speak at a funeral than a wedding, which caught my attention because I haven't done that. And what he brought up was the way that there's just so much around weddings and there's so much pressure and attention to the specifics of the ceremony, where the funerals are sort of the opposite, that it's like there's been all these things happening and everyone's just there. And so he said, like, in a sense, the bar was a lot lower. The expectations of you as a speaker, even though it's a very complex situation to speak into, he felt like there was a lot more liberty in how you could speak and not feel so performative in the way that you get some of those pressures at a wedding. He brought up the way that if the person was a believer, sharing the gospel can flow pretty simply out of that person's own story. As you share their story, you're also sharing their faith. But he also brought up some touch points in the way that the gospel can offer us comfort in grief. It can point us to hope, even as we also are trying to validate the realities of the sting of death and loss. He talked about his intention to focus on the experience of the listener, and so like where they may be in their own processing. And then Darren said he speaks the gospel generally through the way he speaks of the person's story, or even just generally about the person. And so he brought up the idea, and I thought this was really interesting, that all creation declares the glory of God. And so for Darren, he didn't go into this a whole lot, but I understand what he meant. It's not even a matter of if the person was a Christian or not. To him, it was very much, if there's some sort of goodness in a person's life, if there's something that we hold on to and cherish about a person, and that thing in some way is actually an echoing of the goodness of God, their creator. And so that as we celebrate or even remember a person's life, that there's a kind of holding on to something good, and that goodness naturally points everyone to God. I thought that was fascinating. I definitely had not thought of that. And so I appreciated that. When it comes to Christmas and Easter, they both talked about the stories and digging into the stories. Hunter, I appreciated this, talked about just keeping it simple enough. He talked about how diverse, or how there's a lot of folks there often on these holidays you don't know, and just trying to keep things simpler and trying to focus on the micro stories or moments within the stories as a way to sort of slow down within the seasons. And he talked specifically about trying to craft a few strong turns or phrases that he would feel really good leaving. Again, it could be a random person or it could be a regular, but leaving that person with as they left. I really liked that. In fact, I like that enough that I think that's a good idea for probably any sermon. And then also including these holidays. And so I thought that was really great. Darren talked about using the lectionary, and this is interesting because he's from Assemblies of God Church, but they for years have done Advent and Lent connected to the holidays as a way to frame the message in the season. And so he talked about how that already is bringing people into the experience and the reflection of these encounters and the gospel. He talked about how Christmas often pulls in more voices from the prophets, which can do some interesting things. And then I'll just kind of highlight at this point in the interview, there's a way that Darren was starting to trail off and started having trouble. And I think some of it is that these were very pointed questions and not how he likes to talk in a conversation. And so he gave some answers, but then we ended up talking about some other things and then coming back to the conversation for a while. When it comes to how they call folks to respond to the gospel, they both talked about keeping things simple and tangible. Hunter talked specifically about highlighting some practical applications in each sermon or action steps. He brought up the way that the service at Journey actually typically has a kind of response time. You could say an altar call, it's a little bit more flexible than that, and so that can be adapted according to the season, according to the sermon, and what might be addressed there. And so he talked about how that's been really nice to have that flexibility. Darren was way more general, but he talked about how he sees the call as inviting people to listen to and wrestle with God. And I thought that was really interesting. He said he tries to stay connected to real life. And so that when it comes to the gospel, he's trying to make things very concrete and tangible. And I don't think it's because he's trying to walk out all the applications. I think he's actually doing that more in his sort of style of preaching as he gets into stories and is trying to ask questions and things to sort of bring people into that curiosity or confusion. That's sort of his style. And so that was interesting. Again, very different, where I think Hunter would spell things out, Darren probably wouldn't, which is very different. When it came to how their understandings have shifted, they both saw ways that it had. For Hunter, he said things have just become more concrete as he's grown and had kids and things like that he sees a lot more of the concrete daily life tangibility to things, and he thinks that that's affected how he delivers sermons and how he communicates the gospel. He said he often preaches with specific people in mind, like a single mother and a college student, an elderly woman, and so that he has these folks kind of there as his audience in mind as he's writing a sermon. Darren just said he just wants to be more and more simple, not to do too much, that he likes to just sort of take one or two insights within a sermon as a way of passing on what he's received and letting that be. When it came to advice, this is interesting. At this point, Hunter had already shared a lot of advice, and Darren just kept going and going and going, which is really cool. And some of that is because of my relationship with Darren. But Hunter knows my situation in that I've stepped out of full-time ministry as of like last month. And so, and I appreciated this, but he just encouraged me to not stop being a pastor no matter what the job, and to always be working to improve my communication and my care for others. Darren, also knowing me and knowing that I can really dive in deep, and I love to dive in deep, focused a lot or emphasized a lot the need just to keep things simple. His concern that a lot of folks either overvalue or undervalue the role of pastor, and he sees people get crushed by it or overconfident in it, and how those are two poles to be careful about. He brought up Eugene Peterson and a quote, I'm going to butcher this, but something about church is a gathering a bunch of losers, where one of them gets up and talks about God for a little bit. But he said he sort of sees things that way, and that the job, the task in preaching is making room for others to encounter God in their own unique ways, that you don't need to explain everything. It's okay to let people be troubled by what they're reading, and it's wonderful to invite different points of view or even offer different points of view within the stories. So I really appreciated in both of their speaking the way that their own unique styles came out, and also how that I was touched by the way that they were both very happy to speak to me, but also to address me personally in that. And so, so thanks. Look forward to hearing about your own experiences doing this exercise as well.